Next, we will be hearing from Kate Zen, who is here all the way from New York City. She's a community organizer and writer living in New York. She's been engaged with immigrant and labor rights organizing in the Asian American community for the past 12 years, including co-founding the Chinatown Literacy Project in 2004. She's also participated in the sex worker rights movement, working in the past with the Global Network for Sex Worker Projects, the Red Umbrella Project, Streetwise and Safe, and the Sex Workers Outreach Project. Kate. Oh, I don't know, but okay. Thank you.
Well, I also really want to thank Eileen and Chanel for doing just phenomenal organizing. I feel really grateful for the chance to be here and to be able, I've just been blown away by the amazing work that you have done and by Eileen's amazing leadership. Eileen is an amazing outreach worker. I had the blessing to spend 2 days outreaching with her in Toronto, and I've seen her, the way she works with people, the way she's phenomenal, and she's already organized around 200 migrant workers in Toronto, and it's just beginning. So I just really want to thank you for all the work that you've done. I wanted to share a little perspective coming from the U.S. On where a lot of these laws that you're seeing in Canada, a lot of these origins are coming from a very strong U.S. drive, particularly after the Bush administration. So I want to sort of go through a couple of these laws, how they are used to fund law enforcement, border controls, and what is called militarized humanitarianism, as well as other types of humanitarianism existing in NGOs that conflate sex work and human trafficking and cause a lot of harm to the groups of people that they are supposed to be protecting, or they claim to be protecting. So I want to talk about these laws as well as what they look like in the criminal courts. So first, a little bit about the New York Human Trafficking Intervention Courts. These were set up in October of 2013. New York is often seen as the model for the rest of the country in terms of the enforcement of human trafficking and so these courts, they're supposed to be sort of an alternative to incarceration. And in many ways, they are a step forward from what had existed before criminalization. But what basically they're doing is they're doing a kind of therapeutic way of allowing for some people who are arrested for prostitution to get an ACD, adjournment for contemplation of dismissal, if they go to 5 to 6 social therapy sessions. And during these sessions, it's believed that they'll be able to figure out who's a human trafficking victim and who's not. Because obviously in an encounter with law enforcement, it's hard to find the truth. But what you see, these are the good intentions of the program, and what you see is that when you have law enforcement in charge of delivering services to sex workers, what you see is this picture of discriminatory policing in the United States, which is a huge problem, and you hear about it, in the news all the time, right? In Brooklyn, you have 69% of arrested people are Black. In Queens, there's a targeting of East Asian businesses, and so 58% of people who are in the courts are East Asian, and yet there is not sufficient interpretation services. And on top of that, the one service organization, it became 2, that did provide services to East Asian defendants, were under-resourced, and it took 5 to 6 weeks longer for those services to be able to come through. So what you see is that there's racial targeting whenever you have police delivering these services, finding folks who need these services, and it's probably not fair to give police this much discretion. So are there better ways to do that, right? Wanted to sort of touch on something that Eileen talked about earlier, and I think is really on point, is that oftentimes when you're imposing an idea of what a victim looks like in the criminal system and in the social work system, right? So you have this idea of somebody either being a criminal or a victim, and for somebody who's a sex worker, a migrant sex worker, under the conditions in which there's no room for truth, you have to perform this entertaining role for the law or for even the social workers that are supposed to be helping you, right? It's hard to be helped when you can't be yourself, right? So where are the voices of migrant sex workers, and whose agenda are they serving when they're being silenced, right? So I'm going to skip some of this because I know I'm running out of time. but these are some of the U.S. anti-trafficking laws. We're coming from, you know, a start of, in the U.S. it really, the biggest push was in 2000 TVPA, and there's been 3 other reauthorizations of the TVPA since then. It defines severe sex trafficking as recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining by force, fraud, or coercion. I think what Kamala, Professor Kambadji said earlier, which I want to re-emphasize, is that a lot of these things are already existing in criminal law, and these are just being reinforced in these acts, right? There's already laws against any kind of force or fraud or coercion. These are the laws that, you know, we also already have labor laws that would be a much, much better measure of enforcing the kinds of protections that we need for migrant sex workers than this type of carceral politics, right? So what we need to do is step away from anti-trafficking and then move towards enforcing the existing laws, and like Professor Kambadji said, we could really do away with this altogether. So what happens with these legislations? What actually goes through, and where does the funding go? So a lot of times when you look at a bill, and I'm going to go into an example later to this bill, which is really, this is where I want to get to by the end of this, because this is really what I want to talk about. This bill is in Senate right now, and it's, you know, I mean, it passed through the Senate, and it's in the House of Representatives. And what you see here is a lot of the measurements that are increasing policing, increasing law enforcement, you know, all the funding from anti-trafficking is going straight into policing, creating new departments, new salaries and training and consulting, as well as wiretapping initiatives, cyber crime centers. A lot of these things are created under the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement in collaboration with the Department of Defense, which means that what they're doing is this is funding for surveillance. They even have the language of investigative capacity building and data collection. This is, you know, what we hear about a lot from folks who are like info activists who are talking about the NSA, who are talking about the dangers. These are the things that are being funded under anti-trafficking right now, and this is what's on the table. So I just want to take a step back, though, and show that this is not the first time. This has happened historically. In the progressive era, I'm going to tell a really, really quick version of this. The suffragette, women's suffragette movement actually played this strange role, the way that in collusion with creating a series of laws that made immigration and criminal laws, a lot of these laws, in the similar way that like today, like we have a lot of second wave feminists in bed, I guess, with Christian right, to create legislation that's harmful to human trafficking victims. Here, what a lot of suffragettes were arguing was that there was all this exploitation, white slavery in Chinatown, and because of that, what they needed was women to be in politics, right? If women had the right to vote, if women could be in politics, then this would somehow magically be eliminated, right? So they used that as a platform, and they pointed fingers at the immigrants, saying, you need to get rid of these immigrants, this is what's happening, you know, and we need more like laws, like specifically law enforcement against immigration, in order to make sure that that this stuff isn't happening. And so somehow this was used to leverage the women's rights movement. And why that like clash keeps happening in history is a mystery to me, and it's really sad. I wish it didn't happen. But there's a story of Rose Livingston, who went around the country traveling. She was a survivor, she was extremely charismatic, she was a self-styled savior of immigrant sex workers, of people in Chinatown, and a lot of her stories, it turned out, were completely false. But in the process, she like garnered all this attention, and it kind of reminds us of a lot of, you know, Somali Mom, a couple of other people we've heard recently who've also had false survivorhood stories and a lot of exaggerated details. So this is something that's happening and just re-happening again in history, right? And as a result of this, we have the Page Act of 1875 banning Chinese women from entry into the country, which Professor Kambadji talked about. We also have, following that, right in the footsteps of it, the first immigration law in the U.S. targeting an ethnic group, which is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And then also, the Mann Act of 1910, which created the FBI, which made any kind of trafficking of women for the purposes of prostitution across state lines a federal crime. This was actually one of the first federal criminal laws. And so what we see is the creation of the first immigration enforcement and the first like federal criminal laws, all under the name of like white slavery, right? And so this is something, again, we see this repeatedly happening. We see this being sort of log roll, like rolled into moralistic language that is not really debatable, right? So I want to quickly go over these. I really like this quote by Gretchen Sutherland. who writes about sort of a lot of the media and on anti-prostitution, on anti-trafficking. I'll read just the middle section. In these times of war, combating the trafficking of women has become a common denominator political issue, uniting people across the political and religious spectrum against the seemingly indisputable act of oppression and exploitation. It is commonly assumed that only the most callous would criticize efforts to free the world's sex slaves from the clutches of organizing girl trafficking networks. So this is how a terrible bill gets passed through the Congress really, really quickly, right? Because it seems so moralistic, why would anyone ever oppose it? And, you know, this is what's happening with the JVTA right now. I just wanted to say, though, this graphic is pretty interesting. It looks at data. There's a lot of writing already about how the Bush administration and its sort of after 9/11 rolled in human trafficking along with anti-terrorism to get funding for law enforcement and for militarization, right? So if you look at the U.S. and the media coverage on human trafficking, it really soared after 2001, after a strong push by Bush and in the U.S., most of the narratives that talk about why trafficking exists, we'll talk about criminal activity, we'll talk about this sort of violence narrative and the need for criminalization, and so few will talk about the real economic justice issues or criminalization of sex work. So what we need to sort of shift towards, I think, last slide, wait, I want to read this one quote too, because Aline showed me this quote from a migrant sex worker that we were doing outreach with in Toronto. She said, "Without Asian workers, Europe and North America would not have reached this level of development. We neither steal nor rob, so don't criminalize us for working now in your country. Ask the police to stop targeting our businesses." So here's where I wanted to start looking at this issue as a global justice issue, right? We're talking about economic justice, we're talking about borders, we're talking about unequal distribution of resources, where labor is not allowed to go across borders, but capital is, and it exploits. So I want us to really start shifting toward that perspective and really thinking about how, looking at rights not rescue, looking at migrant sex worker rights is an issue that touches immediately at a really, really important issue of what does global citizenship look like now in a world where markets are liberalized, where states have so little control, and who are the people who are hurt by this? Well, how should we really redefine citizenship, and how should we actually stand by ideas of human rights where there's actual enforcement, right? So I think understanding that migrant sex workers, that identity and the struggles lie at the center, at the core of this question, and knowing why it's important to protect migrant sex workers for that reason, I think we should really start looking at these questions from a perspective of here is somewhere where we can start building a framework for global justice, and that's where I hope that we can leave off.